Paul saw himself in a very serious way. His life was dedicated to, everything rotated around the fact that he was a servant to the gospel, that he was a servant of Christ, and that the preaching of the gospel was a central dimension to everything that Paul was. And that should serve as an inspiration and an example. You know, his life was such that he felt comfortable saying, "Follow me as I follow Christ." Now that's a pretty tremendous thing. Paul's life rotated around, it was centered on, it was founded on the significance of who Christ is and the gospel message that he preached to both Jew and Gentile. So Paul was a servant of the gospel. He saw the gospel as the power of God unto salvation. He was not ashamed to preach the gospel. He said that he eagerly desired to preach the gospel to those who were in Rome, which he had not yet done, but he had sent them this letter indicating that he was hopeful to come and see them soon. So the gospel, he said, is the power of God unto salvation. Now, salvation is a huge word. It is a word which we probably in our age and in our generation have belittled somewhat, but it is an all-encompassing word. And Paul saw that salvation was from sin. So as I've been emphasizing, the first portion of this letter to Rome emphasizes the problem that human beings have with sin. And he first emphasizes it under the context of the human race prior to Abraham, the world which might be generally referred to as the Gentiles. And then he also references the fact that the Jews are also struggling with the same problem and in bondage to sin as well. So the gospel and the salvation that God is promoting is salvation from sin. That's important to understand. And it's also important to understand that in Paul's representation of what sin is not something that sort of attacks us. It's not something that attaches itself to us. It's not something that causes our behavior. Sin is a word which describes our moral behavior. Sin is a word which describes our moral choice to depart from God's created design for us. And there are a variety of reasons why people do that. None of them are legitimate reasons. None of them can be offered as excuses when we stand before God. But for various reasons, people make moral decisions to suppress the truth and to pursue a path of unrighteousness. Sin is a moral choice. It's a moral issue. It's not a physical problem. It results in a lot of physical problems, but sin itself is a moral issue. That's important to understand. So what God is attempting to do in the gospel is bring about moral transformation. Salvation, again, is not something God just gives to us. Salvation is not a thing. Salvation is a word which describes everything that is accomplished as a human being comes back into right relationship with God and begins to pursue that relationship. And so all of these things are fundamental in Paul's argument up to this point. I think it's also important here, and this is where some real challenges enter in our ability to discern what Paul is saying, as we've mentioned on a number of times, as Paul looks at the law, and he refers to the law that the Gentiles have and the law of the Jews, and he says a number of things about the law. It's interesting to keep in mind that salvation is not from the law. It's from sin. And there are many reasons why the law with a capital L came into existence, But the interesting thing is this, that in salvation, the process of restoration is not simply supposed to take us back to Moses. It's supposed to take us back to creation. So in a sense, when Paul talks about the law that is written in our hearts, that is the moral law, and God's intention is that as we enter into salvation, we then are empowered and equipped to begin to live, to reflect what we were originally designed to be in the first place, which obviously was prior to his promise to Abraham, prior to the Mosaic law. So, and a lot of that stuff is very challenging to comprehend and to maintain proper distinctions in reference to all of that. But this morning, as I was thinking through some of these things, a passage of Scripture that I find to be very powerful in what it says, and I'm not going to read the entire passage, but in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 22 and 23, we get a glimpse, if you understand Paul's thinking along those lines, that God's intention is to take us back, in a sense, to the beginning. And there are some powerful analogies throughout the book of Romans which further indicates this. But in Ephesians chapter 4, when you read verses 22 and 23, it says, in reference to your former manner of life, and that's referring to the life that you were living in sin, you are to lay aside the old self which is being corrupted in accordance with the lust of deceit. And what is supposed to happen? You are to be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and you are to put on the new self. What is the new self? Which in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness and holiness of truth. Now, if you understand, where do we hear discussion about man and the likeness of God? Genesis 1. So Paul is taking us in his concept of salvation. What God is doing is he's renewing really the creation covenant. He's renewing the foundation related to our creation. We were created in the likeness of God. It was that from which we departed. It is that to which God is working to bring us back in salvation and in Christ. Whether you see it as such or not, I find that amazing. That's what salvation is all about. You know, we live at a period of time where we're sort of hopefully at the tail end of a representation of salvation, which simply, in the minds of many, has to do with giving Jesus permission to take you to heaven. That if when you were 12 years old at a camp meeting, or when you were 16, or just last week, or if you went forward and you gave Jesus permission to take you to heaven when you died, you were saved. And it wasn't about as much about this magnificent transformation and renewal that God is working. But we need to be reminded of the fact that that's what this is all about. This so great salvation, as the writer of Hebrews refers to it. And I think we have truncated, we have belittled, we have reduced salvation in our age, and hopefully are on the tailwind of recovering from that reduction and beginning to see the significance of these things maybe with fresh eyes. Paul said, may the eyes of your heart be enlightened. So, that being said, we're going to begin to look at the passage that Brian read for us. And once again, I think on some level, the wording that Paul uses and the flow of the sentences makes some of this stuff a little bit hard to fully understand. So today, at the risk of being really, really boring, I am simply going to attempt to explain to you what, as best as I can understand, what Paul is saying. I hope someday, when I actually meet Paul, he doesn't say, "Gee whiz, what were you talking about? Where did you ever get that?" But, to the best of my ability to research this stuff and come to some conclusions, we're just going to kind of talk through this passage and try to understand the significance of what Paul was saying in light of the historic context in which it's written and all that stuff. So, he begins. Now, we understand that at this point in the letter, he has been pretty hard on the Jews, strongly emphasizing that they're in sin, they have a problem with sin, they stand guilty before God, and that their heritage, the law, circumcision, all of these things that they have relied upon are not going to solve the problem that they have. That they are instrumental in the overall solution, but they are not the solution. And Paul even said to them, as we said last week, that the name of God is being discredited among the Gentiles because of you. It's being blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Now, that's a pretty harsh criticism to level to somebody. If I were to stand up here and declare to Bart Mennonite Church, that the world of unbelievers out there hate God because of you. That's a pretty harsh criticism. But that's what Paul's saying to the Jews. He's indicating that as the chosen people, as a special people in God's plan of salvation, they've blown it. And not only are they guilty of sin, the same as the Gentiles are guilty of sin, but they even have a heavier responsibility because they have been the chosen people. Right? To whom much is given, much will be required. And so Paul has been pretty hard on them up to this point. Now what Paul does is he enters into a mode whereby he's anticipating what his opponent or what his reader will want to know, what kind of question they're going to ask. And so he begins with this first question and stating it as though it is the opponent. What advantage has the Jew? Or what is the benefit of circumcision? Now you can imagine a Jew after hearing all the stuff that Paul has said up to this point will say what's the big deal about being a Jew then? I mean, you pretty much pulled the rug out from under our feet, Paul. So what advantage is there to being a Jew? What is the benefit of circumcision which God gave to Abraham as a sign? If all the stuff you're saying is true, then in the mind of the individual that would be saying this, all that stuff is worthless and valueless. And Paul, anticipating this, he formulates an answer. Now, in reference to circumcision, let's understand that whenever there's a reference to circumcision, that relates to the sign of the promise that God gave to Abraham. What good, the Jew is saying, what good is it for me to bear in my body this sign of the promise that God gave to Abraham if circumcision is nothing? Why even bother? That's a serious, significant question. Why did God even give it to us, and why do we even bother partaking of it? So the nature of the question is something like this. If the Gentiles are going to be heirs of the promise also, if they're going to benefit from everything God has been doing with us, what benefit is there in being a Jew? What benefit is there in us bearing the mark of the promise? And that's a legitimate question, wouldn't you think? You know, if the Gentiles are going to benefit from this just like we are, why are we going through all this stuff? Now, what Paul does is he avoids two extremes. The one extreme would be simply saying to the Jews, there's no benefit. There is absolutely no benefit in you being a Jew. But he didn't say that. The other extreme would have been characteristic of what a lot of Jews would hope Paul would say, and sort of maybe already thought in their own minds, which is only those bearing the mark of the promise in the flesh will be heirs of the promise. You understand what I'm saying? So, and the Jews, if you read the book of Acts and you understand a lot of what Paul wrote in some other letters, the Jews were struggling with that issue. Even in reference to Gentiles who were getting saved. You remember, the big question was, if these Gentiles are going to get saved, do we require that they be circumcised? Because once again, in their mind, the physical act of circumcision, the external physical act of circumcision, somehow needed to be practiced before you were a recipient or an heir of the promise. But that issue was addressed, and the answer was, no, that's not the case. So Paul avoids those two extremes. What Paul says is that the advantage and the benefit is great in every respect. First of all, they, referring to the Jews, were entrusted with the oracles of God. So Paul's basically saying this: it was a privilege and a benefit to be the people who were given information about what God was up to. Think about that. If there was a very, very important individual, whether it's in the world of business or whatever world you want to think about, it was somebody who was highly respected, who was very successful, and they wanted to pass new information on to the general public. And they chose you as the one to pass the information on. They chose you as the one to give this special information to, and then take to everybody else. That would be a position of privilege. You know, anybody in the company would want to be that person. And so Paul is reminding the Jews that it is through your line of people God has chosen to pass on these oracles, to pass on this information. He gave it to you. That is a great privilege, and it is a great benefit in that, and this is why Paul often says, to the Jew first, and then to the Gentile. You were first in line to benefit from that truth and that information, that clarification, that insight into what God was up to, as he began to unfold and explain the plan of salvation. You were first in line. The first thing that the Jews were given, and actually it was the descendants of Abraham, they were the ones who were given the promise. That promise was passed on from generation to generation, what God promised Father Abraham. And you recall that promise is, I will make you a great nation. Now that in and of itself is a great statement, isn't it? That God himself referred to the descendants of Abraham as a people who he was going to make into a great nation. If you consider that in light of the conflict that Israel seems to continually go through, and somehow survives it all, it's tremendous. I will bless you, God says. I will make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And so God began this process of giving clarification. He gave the promise, and then he began to give clarification through the law. That was the clarification, the understanding, the explanation, the plan that the human race needed. All nations were to benefit from this. And who was it given to, and who was it coming from? It was the Jew. And so Paul is trying to emphasize to them that you have a very privileged place in history. And I mentioned this last week, but it's as though if God were to give you a letter to deliver, and you know that the letter is not for you alone, even though the information in the letter will affect you, if God gave you a letter to deliver, think of the position of privilege that is. But the problem was that the nation of Israel, at a certain point, simply assumed the letter was for them and them only. And instead of actively taking this oracle, this letter, this information to the nations as good news, the Israelites kept it to themselves. And we're going to see that will generate the next question about their faithfulness. And we will consider that here shortly. And the question is, since we didn't do what God wanted us to do, and the information did not get delivered, does that somehow incriminate God's faithfulness to the nations? That's the next question coming up. But here's what I want us to think about. That was a certain phase in history, and that was a certain representation of the information that God was unfolding. And the Jews were unfaithful in handling that responsibility and that position effectively. We all have that so far. The reason that is really important is because by the time we get to Romans 10, Paul is indicating that it's not the Jew in and of himself, it's not the Jew only that now has information the world needs. Who is it? It's those in Christ. And the question which I want to return to then, I think, at the end of this message, is just for us to reflect on this question. As the Jews were unfaithful with their responsibility to deliver the message, where do we stand in regard to that very same issue? That's a very important thing that we need to consider. Because we are now the ones entrusted with God's message. And for the Jew, it's almost as though Paul could say to them, God gave you the chance and the opportunity to be the hero. They could have played, we live in a world, for as long as probably human beings can remember, we've been looking for a hero. You know, I know people that are just crazy into superhero stuff, right? Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk and all these superheroes. Or even if you go into a lot of the myths or other important pieces of fiction that have been written over the years, one of the main themes that man cannot seem to get away with is somehow we always want there to be a hero. The knight in shining armor that comes to the rescue. And Paul is in a sense saying to the Jews, you had the opportunity to be that hero. To be the ones who rode in on the white horse and gave the world the message they were dying to hear. But you didn't do it. So then the next question that arises is this. What then? And New American Standard translates it this way. If some did not believe, their unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God, will it? But I believe that the phrase not believe and the word unbelief should be translated unfaithful and unfaithfulness. In other words, if some were unfaithful, their unfaithfulness did not nullify the faithfulness of God, did it? Again, that's a question that Paul is assuming his reader might want to ask. And so Paul offers an answer to that. The question is, does the unfaithfulness of some, and I believe the word some there is very important, because it's going to be compared to the word every man a little later, soon. But does the unfaithfulness of some, and I would assume that Paul is using the word some there because he's actually referring to the Jews. They were the some that were given the oracles of God, the promise and the law. They were the sum of what? They were some of the human race. A limited portion of the human race that God chose to deal with in this way. He even called them into existence for this purpose. And Paul is saying, if some, the Jews, were unfaithful, does their unfaithfulness incriminate God? Does it belittle his faithfulness or speak of him somehow being unfaithful because what he had intended to accomplish through them didn't get accomplished? Paul's answer is simply this: may it never be. Rather, he says, let God be found true, though every man be found a liar. And again, I think there's a comparison here. Previously, he says some, that if the unfaithfulness of some does not eliminate the faithfulness of God. In fact, Paul is saying, if everybody was unfaithful, God is still seen as faithful, even in the midst of all of our unfaithfulness. And then Paul goes on to quote from Psalm 51, and it is a quote which is an expression that David used when he himself was being judged by God for his unfaithfulness in reference to his relationship with Bathsheba. Paul quotes as a defense for his position, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. That's David speaking about God, as God brought judgment on David. Then Paul says this, but if our unrighteousness, and again, he's anticipating what his reader might say, what the Jew might say in response to this. If our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, okay, if God's not found unfaithful, if God's not found unrighteous in any of this, if our unrighteousness ends up demonstrating God's righteousness, what shall we say? The God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is he? And then Paul says, I am speaking in human terms. In other words, I believe what Paul is saying there is, I'm making that statement as another human being would make in response to what I'm saying. Okay? I'm anticipating that the average human being is going to respond to what I'm saying by saying this. The God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is he? May it never be. For otherwise, how will God judge the world? But if, again anticipating, but if through my lie the truth of God abounded to his glory, why am I also still being judged as a sinner? And you can see the reasoning going on here. And why not say, and Paul interjects, as we have slanderously slanderously reported, and as some claim we do say, why not say, let us do evil that good may come? So you see the reasoning is they're saying this, okay, if when I did something really sinful and stupid and unfaithful and unrighteous, it actually put the righteousness of God on display in the way he responded to me, then isn't that a good thing? If my bad behavior results in God's name and reputation being lifted up, then doesn't that somehow make my bad behavior good? Doesn't somehow my bad behavior serve a good purpose? And if it does, why is God judging me as a sinner? Crazy reasoning, but that's the reasoning Paul is attempting to diffuse and to get rid of. And I don't know if you've ever run into it or not, but when you're trying to reason with some people, that's the kind of stuff you run into. I don't know if you've recognized it or not, but we don't live in an age that is tremendously reasonable. There are not a whole lot of people out there, Christians included, by the way, who are really actually reasonable people. Most of what drives people's behavior, their responses, is emotion and preference, not reason. And Paul was dealing with that. If you're going to come up with a very unreasonable justification for bad behavior by saying when God judges bad behavior, it puts his righteousness and faithfulness on display, therefore my bad behavior is good, and if my bad behavior is good, why is God judging me as a sinner? Paul said, I want to make sure you understand that that's totally unacceptable reasoning. And what he says of such people who would attempt to employ such reasoning is, their condemnation is just. Once again, why is Paul going through all of this? Because he's attempting to convince the Jew that all of his excuses, all of his explanations, all of his justifications, all of the things that he might have been relying on, like his heritage, or like circumcision, or like the law, they will get you nowhere. And all of the ways you attempt to justify it, you still stand justly condemned before a righteous God. Why did he want them to know that? Because it's preemptive to actually receiving the actual solution. So it wasn't an unloving thing to do. It was actually an expression of Paul's love for the Jews, to bring them into a proper understanding of their guilt. And then he ends by saying this, what then? Are we better than they? You know, there are benefits, there are privileges, there are advantages to being a Jew, but does that mean that being the chosen people of God, being the people that God called into existence, being the people who God gave the promise to, being the people who had the sign of the promise, being the people who had the law, does that make us better than the rest of the world? And Paul says, no. It is on that foundation that Paul is going to proceed to explain. And if you remember, one of the statements that Paul made previously was this idea: there is no partiality with God. When it comes to these issues, the playing field is level. Now, Paul eventually applies that even beyond the controversy of Jew and Gentile, because there are many ways in our culture that we have uneven playing fields. In the Jewish culture, one of those uneven aspects would have been the relationship between a man and a woman. That is still very popular in Islamic parts of the world. A woman is maybe one step above a dog. But what does Paul later say? In Christ there is no male, female, Jew, Gentile, slave, master. And so at this point, that argument is rotating around the relationship between a Jew and a Gentile. And Paul was in the process of breaking down misconceptions that kept the Jews from returning to a right relationship with God through the one and only provision that was made for all men in Christ. I believe that's a demonstration of what Paul says part of his ministry was. Part of his ministry was to destroy speculations and everything raised up against the knowledge of God. And we see Paul, with great insight and great wisdom, great perseverance, destroying the speculations that the Jews had that was actually keeping them from entering back into right relationship with God. Later we recognize that Paul does that not only with the Jew but with the Greek. But in order to do that with people, you need to understand their worldview, their perspective, their way of thinking. Right? And that's why Paul could even anticipate, okay, when I tell them this, knowing how they think, they're going to ask this question. So I'll just go ahead and answer the question now before they ask it. You know, sometimes that gets you in trouble, by the way. At least it gets me in trouble. Because sometimes when I'm talking to somebody and they get halfway into a sentence, I already know what they're going to ask, so I start answering the question before they ask it. And that's kind of rude. But sometimes I just can't help myself. But you understand, if you begin to see how people think, how they reason, and where they're going with their logic, then you can be prepared to address those issues. And I believe this is a great example of Paul doing that in this letter he's writing at this point with the Jews. Okay? Now, as we close, I want to return to that simple question I asked earlier because I believe it is a very, very important question. The Jews had something very precious, very valuable, very special. It was information that God Himself in His wisdom decided to give to them for a good reason. It was crucial information in the process of unfolding the entire plan of salvation. It was a significant piece of the puzzle. If you can imagine, if you have, let's say you have a puzzle that's a 20-piece puzzle. And so you have 20 kids, and you give each one of the kids a piece of the puzzle. And one of the kids run off with their piece. They don't want to put it in the puzzle. That's their piece. The puzzle never gets completed. And it's almost as though when God gave the Jews that piece of the puzzle that was going to be part of the whole picture. It wasn't the whole picture, but it was an important piece of the puzzle. The Jews took it to themselves. Said, this is ours. The question we need to ask is this. We have been given something which the world desperately needs. And we can sit back and point our finger and criticize but what we need to do is take, at this time, a completed puzzle and take that to the world. Or will we find ourselves in the same position the Jews were in? It's a very serious question to ponder.